At Pleasant Valley, we love addressing the most non-controversial things we can. We just don't like rock and boat. So we chose sexuality and gender, and we thought that would be fun. So next week, we're going to talk through Sexuality 101 and what is God's design for sexuality. Week 3, so it'll be 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to do all things related to gender, in particular the transgender movement and how Christians should be thinking about that biblically. What does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? And then in our last week, we will talk about what is the Christian response to the sexual and gender revolution? And then, very specifically, parents, grandparents, mentors, how do we speak to our kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, students, athletes, if we're a coach, about these very controversial issues? And that's going to be very important. All right, but tonight we're going to start with kind of addressing the current state of affairs in our culture as it relates to sexuality and gender, and how we got here historically. So honestly, tonight will probably be the least Bible we do. We're going to look at Romans 1 up front, but then mostly after that tonight, more of a historical analysis some sociology as to how we got here, because I think that's really going to help us understand what the future holds. Okay? In 1932, English author Aldous Huxley wrote a book called A Brave New World. His vision of the future was one in which there was a small elite class of very wealthy people who would do nothing all day but eat and play and have sex all day long. There was no family in his vision. There was no marriage. There was no commitment. The words mother and father were banned and outlawed. All the children were raised in state-sponsored homes. And so this group of elite people would just eat, drink, have sex, be naked, and marry all day long. Sounds like a sci-fi fantasy show on HBO. But maybe in reality, we're not as far from that vision as we think. He wrote that in 1932. And in 2023, here we are. Looking at the fall of Rome, the great Roman Empire that we all studied about in World Civ class in high school, historian Will Durant wrote over 50 years ago, he said, and I quote, "A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself within." The main driving force behind the destruction of Rome, that empire that, like the Titanic, was thought to be the unsinkable ship. But one of the driving forces behind the fall of Rome was actually a moral collapse, much of which was sexual in nature. For example, widespread homosexuality among the upper classes in Rome led to a decline in birth rates among the aristocrats. As a result, reducing the available pool of leadership manpower. Speaking of Rome, though, the Apostle Paul wrote a letter to the Roman church. It's the book of Romans. It was a letter that was prophetic in nature then, but for us 2,000 years later. So I want to start tonight with God's Word, Romans chapter 1. If you have your Bible, you can turn there. If not, we're going to have the verses for you up here. Here's what the Apostle Paul wrote to Rome. In verse 18 of chapter 1, he said, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." So here's the question the Apostle Paul is addressing. How do you know when the judgment of God has fallen upon a nation? How do you know when the wrath of God has been unleashed on a culture? Starting in verse number 24, Paul gives us the signs. Verse 24, "Therefore God gave them up." That's judgment language. God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Notice that's language of sexual sin. Verse 26. For this reason, God gave them up. Again, that's judgment language. He gave them up to dishonorable passions. Now, notice here, he's going to talk about males and females and sexuality. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men, likewise, gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Of course, that's same-sex sin. And then he says, that's men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. So when you trace Paul's argument back to the first verse we read in verse 18, here's what we see. It's not just that God is going to pour out judgment on sexual sin. It's not what Paul says. He says sexual sin and gender confusion is the judgment of God. That's your first fill in the blank, I think. Sexual sin and gender confusion is the judgment of God. So when you look at the current state of affairs as it relates to gender and sexuality, I'm not suggesting that the wrath of God is coming. I'm suggesting that the judgment of God is already here. Because the Bible says there comes a time when God gives a people up. And God essentially says in Romans 1, fine. If you want to rebel against my natural design for gender and sexuality, that's the language Paul uses in verse 26 to 27. He says, if you want to go against that, have at it. Drive yourself and your civilization off the cliff. It's what happened to Rome. And it's what's happening here. So I think one of the most lethal weapons disintegrating our society from within is a sexual and gender revolution. But it's important not to frame this mostly in political terms, which is our temptation because we're such a politically divided nation. It's Fox versus CNN. I don't want you to think about it in that way. This is a revolt not mainly against 1950s, Leave It to Beaver, old school conservative values. That's not what this is a revolt against primarily. The sexual and gender revolution is a revolt against the very fabric and foundation of society that God created all the way back in Genesis chapter 1. This is not a political or social revolution. This is a cosmic revolution against our Creator. So the stakes are very high. But like in Rome, it hasn't happened overnight. For example, as Carl Trueman points out, any Rolling Stone fans in the house? Show your age there. Some of you may remember this. We have come a long way from the moment in the 1960s when the Rolling Stones had to change the lyrics of the song, Let's Spend the Night Together. They had to change the lyrics to Let's Spend Some Time Together in order to be allowed to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. My, how things have changed. Fast forward 60 years. Today's songs that our kids are listening to, today's songs are marketed to teenage girls, for example, very often contain sexually explicit lyrics far beyond anything Mick Jagger ever could have dreamed of recording. And these songs are often accompanied by videos that flaunt the singer's sexuality in a way that is grossly graphic, if not pornographic. But again, that didn't happen overnight. Dr. Albert Mohler, president of Southern Seminary, wrote this, quote, he said, "The moral collapse of a civilization does not come as a singular event, but as a series of little compromises and moral adjustments a society makes over a period of years or even decades." So what I'm suggesting is we didn't get to where we are in America overnight. This didn't happen because of one election. This didn't happen because of one piece of legislature. This is something that's been happening for decades to get us to where we are. But the problem is the train has left the station, and it is accelerating wildly out of control. And outside of the return of Jesus himself, it ain't coming back. So how did we get to where we are from a historical perspective? I'm borrowing tonight largely from Portland, Oregon's John Mark Comer and much of his research. He points out that one social commentator makes the case that no generation in history has been through as much change as we have in the past 50, 60 years. Just think about that for a minute. Think about all the change we've experienced in just over a half century. We used to let, apparently, kids smoke cigarettes, for example. That's kind of a humorous example, but I don't know if anybody actually let their kids smoke. But seriously, think about 50, 60 years ago. No internet. Can you even imagine life without the internet? No emails. No smartphones, no artificial intelligence, gay marriage, civil rights, terrorism. You didn't used to have to take your shoes off in the airport till 9/11. That's a new development. Globalism, the mapping of the human genome, the rise of the great Buc-ee's gas station is something my grandma and Papa Stella's never got to experience. Times they are a-changing. So, in all seriousness, no wonder there's so much social unrest and anxiety. We've never been more anxious and medicated than we are today. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is so much change so fast. And a lot of that change is in the area of sexuality. So there have been 5 major shifts in the culture in the way we express sexuality in just 1 or 2 generations. Some of the things we're going to speak about tonight, my grandparents could not, they're in heaven. They would not even be able to fathom this is the world that we live in. And if that is true, imagine in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. And that's why Carl Trueman writes, we are living in a strange new world. So 5 major cultural shifts we need to understand as Christians to know how we got to where we are. Here's the first major shift. Sex has been disconnected from childbearing and family. So birth control came around 1960 when the FDA approved the first oral contraceptive. And then I think it was 1972 that the Supreme Court legalized birth control for single people. So, keep coming back to my grandparents. For my grandparents and their generation, unless they were married, birth control would have been illegal. Now, just think about the implications of that. Here's what Trueman writes. Kind of a lengthy quote here, but it's helpful. He says, the advent of the birth control pill allowed women to take control of their own fertility and made it very easy to sever the link between sex and pregnancy. This changed the context of sexual activity. In the 19th century, if a man wanted to have sex with a girl, it was a risky venture because it could easily lead to pregnancy and thus present serious social difficulties for him. Marriage in such a context was the safest way to pursue sexual activity. And to do so, a man likely had to be clean. He had to have a job in order to persuade a woman that he could offer security. And ideally, the man had to wait right up until the moment of marriage, as the woman probably had a father and brothers who would have strong opinions about her being impregnated by someone who might not then abandon his responsibilities. With the pill, the risk, financial and social, of sex were dramatically lowered, though. The idea of sex as a pleasant recreation without the need for long term commitment is simply more plausible in a world with access to the pill. So that was a major event in our country's history that caused a shift in the way we have disconnected sex from procreation, family, kids. Here's a second major shift, and it's similar. Sex has been disconnected from marriage. Sex has now been disconnected from marriage. Sex is no longer just for two people in a relationship until death does them part, as it was in almost every single culture down through human history until now. Not that there weren't outliers, of course, there's always been sex outside of marriage, but the point is the cultural norm, even for non-believers, was, well, sex is for two married people, man and woman, until they die. Like that was the general moral compass of society. Not anymore. According to the Pew Research Center, cohabitation, of course that just means two people living together that are not married, cohabitation rates are at an all-time high. The percentage of people living together has more than doubled in the past 25 years. And now, for the first time in history, more people have cohabitated than have been married. 59% of Americans have lived with someone they're not married to. Only 50% of Americans have been married. 78% of people between 18 and 29 years old say it's okay for an unmarried couple to live together. So again, the trend culturally is sex has been disconnected from marriage. We're a culture that's high on pleasure, low on commitment. Complicating things, kind of as a subcategory here. Even in marriage, there's been significant changes. For example, the rise of no-fault divorce in the past 50 years has kind of reduced marriage, for many at least, to nothing more than a sentimental bond that we hold on to until we're no longer happy. But here's the third major shift. Sex has been disconnected from male-female relationships. I just want us to think about how quickly this has happened. We are only 8 years into the legalization of gay marriage in the United States. This would have been unthinkable and unimaginable for all human civilizations before us for thousands and thousands of years in human history. And we forget that not that long ago, it was unthinkable even here in America. So, for example, it was not conservative President George Bush initially, but it was President Bill Clinton in 1996 who signed into law the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, which banned the federal recognition of same-sex marriage. That was Clinton. It was just in the mid-2000s that President Barack Obama was against same-sex marriage. It's funny how people will shift their views on things in order to get elected. But my point is, it wasn't that long ago that even here in America, the thought of gay marriage was unthinkable, even by those as far as they could be on the left. And yet here we are. And we don't even think about it. It's the norm. That's a massive tectonic cultural shift. Here's the fourth major shift. As Comer points out, sex has largely been disconnected from love, emotion, and relational commitment. Sex is now with no strings attached. So the hookup culture, as it's known, is pervasive. And we have new apps that make it quick and easy. No pun intended. The hookup culture, apps like Tinder with over 75 million users, including 12 million matches or hookups a day. Donna Fretz, in her book, The End of Sex, has a great summary of the most recent data. She points out some interesting things happening sociologically. She says more and more people are delaying marriage to focus on career. So, not family anymore in a way that it would have been for our grandparents or parents for that matter, depending on how old you are. So, not family, not marriage, but money and career have become the meaning and purpose of life. So, increasing numbers of people are not even thinking about starting a family until grad school was paid off. They have a high paying job and a big fat down payment ready for a house. That can take, 10, 15 years maybe after graduation? And yet, here's the problem. There's nothing wrong with delaying marriage in simply in terms of when you get married. But the problem is, the longer it is delayed, during that time, people still want to have sex typically while they're waiting to start a family. So they still want to have sex, but they want it without any true form of commitment. Because commitment is hard work, and commitment is time consuming, and commitment is expensive, and commitment is sacrificial, and commitment is expensive, and commitment is exclusive. And who has time for that kind of commitment in marriage when you're trying to climb the corporate ladder as fast as you can? But here's the fifth cultural shift, and I came up with my own language on this one. Sex has been depersonalized. It's been depersonalized. Now, on one hand, the sexual and moral revolution means anything goes with anybody at any time. Nothing is out of bounds sexually anymore, right? So sex before marriage, sex outside of marriage. We have entire websites like Ashley Madison built for nothing but for married people looking to have affairs. There's like 80 million users in America. So, I mean, homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, male, female, both, anybody, anywhere, it's okay, says the culture. But here's what's interesting. At the same time, there's an ironic crisis that is brewing. Some of y'all are not going to believe this when you see it on the screen. Young people are having less sex than they have ever had in over 50 years. Did you know that? I didn't know that, so I just found out recently. Young people are having less sex than they ever have before in 50 years. Now, at first, Christians are like, well, that's great. All the Southern Baptists are like, finally, true love waits. We've been preaching that since the 80s. All those promise rings finally paid off, and we finally scared them enough with all those disgusting pictures of chlamydia in sex ed class, we knew that would get them eventually. Sorry if anybody had a visual. I should have just kept it general, STD. I didn't have to be very specific with chlamydia. But here's the thing. Young people are having less sex, and it has nothing to do with true love waits. It has nothing to do with morals or values or even STDs. It has nothing to do with anything good or noble. 2 reasons young people are having less sex than before. Number 1, pornography. We should probably give a whole night to nothing but this issue of pornography. I don't know that we're going to be able to do that, but we should. Musician John Mayer. Any John Mayer fans? Who, in spite of the fact, let's be honest, John Mayer has and could be with any woman in the world anytime he wanted. Mayer went on record stating he prefers pornography over actually being with a woman. But apparently he's not alone. With porn, there's no strings attached. With porn, there's no potential for relational conflict. With porn, there's no paying for gas and dinner first. With porn, there's no need to worry about pregnancy or STDs. You can do it at work. You can do it in the bathroom. You can do it while your spouse or parents are watching TV in the room next door. Anytime, anywhere, and it's all free. Carl Trueman writes, and I quote, "No longer does use of pornography carry the social stigma it once did." See, in 20 years ago, you had to have the audacity to go into the adult section of, the video store. Or you had to have that awkward thing where you get the Playboy in the gas station and you're like, what if the preacher's there? What if, my wife's friends see me? You don't have to do any of that anymore. It can be accessed privately without the risk, or at least the perceived risk, that purchasing a magazine or entering certain establishments used to carry. And porn stars are now a staple of popular TV shows, the college lecture circuit, and the bookshelves at Barnes & Noble. Indeed, it speaks volumes that a baby onesie with the words "future porn star" emblazoned on the front is today available as a real item of clothing. Porn is about bodies, not faces. Porn is about pleasure, not people. I think few things are doing more damage to relationships and to God's design for sexuality than pornography. I think it is one of Satan's most effective and destructive tools. And I don't think Christians are talking about it nearly enough. So parents, grandparents, I want to encourage us. We need to be having conversations with our kids about things. Oh, my kid would never do that. Well, maybe not, but his or her friends are. And everybody at school is. And it's all around us. We need to be talking about these things. I know it's awkward. I've talked to my kids about stuff like that, right? Like, this is what's out there. It's awkward. But I really want to encourage us to have these kinds of conversations. And please, parents, we need to have rules. To allow a child or a teenager in particular to have unrestricted access to the internet in the privacy of their room all throughout the night, that is borderline insanity. If we think that something like that could not creep into our home. So the first reason young people aren't having as much sex anymore is because of porn. Second thing, though, is it's because of these smartphones and social media. In other words, this generation of young people, they don't know how to talk anymore, which means they don't know how to flirt anymore. And very rarely does sex happen unless you talk or flirt first. Seriously. Unless you're Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie, but for the rest of us, for society, the ability to have human conversations is necessary for physical intimacy. But nowadays, young people, they don't talk, they text. A young man no longer has to muster up the courage to ask a girl out on a date in between math and science class in the hallway. They don't do that anymore. Those days are over. Boys don't take girls on date, they Snapchat them. You don't have to strike up a conversation with a person of the opposite sex at a social event. You swipe them on Tinder. It eliminates all the anxiety, eliminates all the, what if I say the wrong thing? You don't have to do any of that anymore. This generation doesn't sit on the couch and make out while mom and dad are in the room next door, right? They don't sit on the couch and make out pretending to watch a movie. Don't act like you ain't been there. We all did it. Oh, we're just watching a movie. Sure, yeah, bet you are. Young people don't even have to do that anymore. Because instead, they send inappropriate pictures of each other on their cell phones. Now, parents and grandparents, maybe all of what I just said sounds like Greek. Like, what is that? What are you even talking about? Well, that is the world our kids are living in. It is a strange new world. Sex has been depersonalized, and you can have all of it you want right here and never leave the house. So this is why I think next week is super important. Try to come back because we're going to talk about God's design for sexuality and hopefully how we can talk to our kids about some of those things, all right? Now, let's shift gears to another direction. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, the Bible says there's nothing new under the sun. So in a way, these 5 shifts we've talked about have always been around in some form or fashion. I mean, outside of maybe artificial intelligence, that's kind of a brand new one. I don't think they had sex robots in the days of John the Baptist. It's one thing he didn't have to deal with. But people sleeping together outside of marriage has always happened. That's not a new sin. Homosexuality is littered all throughout Greek mythology, the Old Testament. Gay relationships is nothing new. And even you see some gender fluidity, that's week 3, has a long history in some indigenous cultures. So even the idea of, well, I've got the biology of a man, but maybe I'm a woman, like, even that isn't necessarily brand new. But here's the difference. Sexuality outside of God's design isn't simply accepted in today's culture, it's been normalized. When a culture normalizes sin, over time, that culture becomes numb and desensitized to sin. Let me give you an example. Not necessarily of sin, but just of how we can become desensitized over time. I can't necessarily recommend this show because it's got a lot of unchristian things in it, but do we have any Walking Dead fans after I said that? Will anybody admit it? So I remember trying that show several years ago, and I remember that first episode of Walking Dead is so intense. I mean, the first 5 seconds, there's like blood and guts, and there's zombies, and I mean, it's just super, super graphic. And I remember saying to a friend of mine that was a huge Walking Dead, they've been trying to get me to watch it forever, and I finally, all right, I'll try it. And I said, man, like, that's so intense to my stomach. Like, how do you watch that? And they said, after 6 or 7 episodes, you get used to all the blood and zombie guts. And, the point is, that's kind of what's happened with the sexual and gender revolution. We've just kind of gotten used to it. Whether heterosexual, homosexual, when sexual promiscuity, for example, on the TV screen right in front of us no longer makes us blush, our conscience has been rocked to sleep. Our souls are numb. But not only has sexuality and gender expressions outside of God's design been normalized, they're now being forced upon everyone, whether you like it or not. So there is an underlying agenda to this revolution. We are experiencing what some have called a moral revolution. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Theo Hobson, a British liberal thinker, defines a moral revolution in this way. He says there's 3 stages. Let me read them to you, then we'll come back and break them down. The first stage of a moral revolution is that which was repudiated, that's a fancy word that just means denied or rejected. That which was repudiated must be celebrated. Stage number 2, that which was celebrated must now be repudiated or denied or rejected. And then those who will not celebrate must themselves be repudiated. All right, now let me break that down. Here's stage 1 of a moral revolution, and I'm making the argument we have experienced all 3 stages. In fact, we're in stage 3 right now. Stage 1, though, is this. That which was repudiated must be celebrated. So let's take, for example, the LGBTQ movement as part of this moral revolution. Okay. Of course, there were exceptions, but by and large, in all civilizations in human history, Christian or pagan, sex was understood to be between a man and a woman in marriage. That was the cultural norm. And you were either male or female, and it wasn't hard to figure out which one you were. You just opened up your britches. And it wasn't controversial, okay? And anything contrary to that was by and large repudiated or rejected by the culture, Christian or not. That is, if you did not hold to the traditional view of gender and sexuality, then you are the one out of step with the rest of the culture. Speaking of LGBTQ, Albert Mohler writes, quote, Throughout most of those centuries, some of those letters, LGBTQ, wouldn't have even been imaginable. But in the course of the sexual and moral revolution that has taken place, that which was condemned is now celebrated. It's not just tolerated, it's celebrated. It's celebrated in society, it's celebrated in advertising, it's celebrated in Hollywood, it's celebrated in academia, and the demand is we must all celebrate. So in the 1990s, it was Bill Clinton who signed into law Don't Ask, Don't Tell as it related to sexual orientation in the military. Now, whatever your thoughts are on that policy, it doesn't matter. The point I'm making is 20 years later, it's the exact opposite. Now we have a whole month dedicated to gay pride. We have very public and provocative, and in some cases, we have X-rated parades that are happening in every major U.S. city with kids present. That is not celebrating anything. That is child abuse. We have drag shows in downtown Owensboro. The White House flies the gay pride flag. Biological men may now play female sports. Biological men may now use the women's restroom, while your 13-year-old daughter is one stall over. None of that would have even been thinkable 25 years ago. I mean, people would have looked at you in the 90s like you had lost your mind if you said any of those things would be happening in 2023. So, stage one of the moral revolution has happened. That which was repudiated is now celebrated. Here's stage number two. That which was celebrated must be repudiated. Here's what we mean by that. What was originally celebrated, and in this case, I mean sex between a man and a woman in marriage, and the conviction that gender is determined by our biological sex. I mean, just the basics, the birds and the bees, okay? That old school, ancient, outdated view must now be condemned altogether, so says the culture. In other words, the historic Judeo-Christian view on sex, marriage, and gender that humans have had from the beginning of time, that's no longer even considered to be a reasonable option by many people. Those traditional views are said to be wrong and completely out of touch with modern reality. The historical biblical worldview on sex and gender is viewed as a threat to true moral progress and human flourishing. So now if you hold through the traditional view, you're the bad guy. You're the problem with society. But then the third stage, which I think we are in. Third stage of a moral revolution is those who will not celebrate this new morality must themselves be repudiated or condemned. This is what we call the cancel culture. Take Hollywood, for example. If you don't line up with the LGBTQ agenda in Hollywood, you're canceled. Many in Hollywood have lost jobs because they won't get in line with the times. Even, God bless them, the Hallmark Channel. But you know I have such a special place in my heart. Watched my first one last night when Halloween was officially over. Even the Hallmark Channel has given in to the cultural pressure and coercion. Same thing is true in academia. That just means higher education. Moeller writes, quote, "There is no more coercive environment on planet Earth than higher ed." So think about colleges and university. Who gets hired, who gets tenure, which textbooks get used, what student rules are going to be. If you don't celebrate the sexual and moral revolution, you're not just not in the cool kids club, you're not even welcomed at the table anymore. You're an imposter, you're a threat, you're demonized. You have Christian preachers in Canada that are being arrested for hate speech if they give a sermon on homosexuality as a sin. And America will be next. For many, to object to any or all of the LGBTQ movement, essentially, it puts you in the same moral category as being a racist. So Carl Trueman writes, the era when Christians could disagree with broader convictions of the secular world and yet still find themselves respected as decent members of society at large is coming to an end. If indeed it is not already ended, we are living as strangers in a strange new world. So that's kind of how we got to where we are. That's where we are. But let me conclude with this. How's that worked out for us? How are we doing as a society? How would you grade us in terms of our level of joy and happiness in life? For all of the sexual and gender freedom we now experience, there has never been more pain, wounds, abuse, anger, violence, dysfunction, fear, regret, guilt, and shame than there is now. In short, the sexual and gender revolution has overpromised and underdelivered. That's your next blank. What promised life and peace has brought loss and pain. People may think, man, what's the big deal? Loosen up. It's just sex. Who's ever been hurt by a little sex? Brothers and sisters, the right question is, who has not in this room been hurt by sex? Name one person who has not been hurt in some form or fashion by the things we've talked about tonight. Name one person in your family or your friends or your social circle who, if they are honest, have not had some kind of deep pain from one of the following: from a mom or dad who left the family, from a divorce, from betrayal or infidelity, from finding a spouse or a child looking at porn, from abuse, trust issues in a relationship, from a child that's questioning their gender identity, and parents are trying to figure out, what do we do? From a teenager who struggles with an eating disorder because they look in the mirror and they hate what they see, because they don't look like the model on the cover of the Victoria's Secret magazine, and they know that's what the boys like. Who can measure up? So our culture's attempt in the last half century to disconnect sex from family, marriage, commitment, at best it's naive, and at worst it's destroying us as a nation. And yet as every year passes, we're only becoming more and more confused and more broken. The lines between right and wrong and sexuality and gender are becoming increasingly blurred. And as Christians and the church, we're finding ourselves in uncharted territory. I mean, what do you do, church? What do you do if a young person comes to your church, a young man, and he wants to go to the women's restroom? How do you handle that on a Sunday morning? What do you say? Here's our temptation. Our temptation is going to be, Christians, to point the finger at this culture going wild. And we get angry, get all riled up. On one hand, we must speak the truth with conviction. But we must speak that conviction with compassion. and humility and gentleness. Pleasant Valley Community Church, please do not become an angry, judgmental church. Don't let me become an angry, judgmental pastor who gets up here and rants and raves about the culture. What this broken world needs from us is not a sermon. What they need from us is love and a listening ear and grace and compassion. Yes, speaking truth, but in love and gentleness. Here's why. It's because it's not exactly like the church has knocked this whole sexual purity thing out of the park. I mean, it's kind of like, let's get the plank out of our eyes before we worry about the gay club that we want to throw rocks at. There's not a week that goes by where the headlines don't tell the story of another sex scandal in the church. And so it's like, man, if you're the culture and you're not a Christian, why would you listen to our message? We have no credibility. Rampant sexual abuse in both the Catholic and the Protestant church for decades. How do we even know the church is a safe place for those that are questioning their identity in terms of their gender or their sexuality? Why would they come to us, given our track record? Pastors having affairs like crazy, ministers soliciting prostitutes, professing Christians viewing pornography on a regular basis, Christians living together, having sex before marriage like it's no big deal, Christian married couples rarely coming together physically, neglecting the gift of sex God gave to keep them together. That too is sexual sin. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So, guys, we can't be judgmental and angry because we get a D probably on this whole sexual purity thing as the church. But here's the last reason we got to be humble and gracious as we're having this conversation is because these issues we're discussing tonight, y'all, are not just out on the West Coast. This is not San Francisco. This is right here in Owensboro, Kentucky. This is right here in our own church. Brothers and sisters, we have dear families in our church that right now are wrestling through a number of these issues with their children or grandchildren. And we have people right now in our own church that are hurting from abuse in the past, sexual trauma, wrestling through issues related to sexual orientation or gender. It's right here. It's us. And so we can't stand up with this holier than thou attitude pointing fingers. Let's be the body of Christ that's gentle and compassionate and sympathetic, listening well, loving well. Because this stuff really hits home with more families in our congregation than any of us will ever know. All that to say, if you're here tonight and you are struggling with God or sexuality or gender or sexual brokenness or hurt or pain from your past, you're not alone. All of us in this room have a story of sexual brokenness. And so you're all welcome here. This is a safe place where together we can love and listen. And together we can look to God's word and find forgiveness and grace and healing that comes from Jesus Christ alone. We're all sexual sinners. And yet Jesus died for this too. In fact, Jesus hung naked on a cross. He hung naked on a cross. Adam and Eve were naked after they sinned and ashamed. Jesus hung naked, bearing our shame on the cross for all of our sexual sin. He was publicly exposed in the most humiliating way. He was mocked, he was exposed, he was shamed to the fullest extent. And he did it for our sexual brokenness, for our lust, but also for our abuse, for our pain. And he did it because he loves us. Okay, it's 7:04. Let's do this. There's no pressure for anyone to speak at your table. The nature of this topic, no pressure. But we do have 3 questions for Q&A on your handout on the screen. I'd love for us to take some time and walk through some of those questions with the people at your table. Now, maybe you're sitting with someone you've never met them before tonight. That might be real awkward. But here's what I want to say. This is a safe place, all right? Everybody in here, let's just all do the honor code thing. We're going to honor God in these conversations. We're not here to judge. We're not here to what said at your table stays at your table. All right, we're not going to go texting our friends or posting on Facebook. Guess what I found out tonight? We're not. So just have a conversation. See if we can have some community around these questions. And then either me or Dan will hop up in the next 15, 20 minutes and wrap us up. All right, let's do that. By the way, if it's awkward silence, somebody at the table, step up and be a leader, all right? Somebody break the ice. Just read the first question and just see what happens. Hey, everybody. Hey, a couple of quick things before we go our separate ways tonight. Keep texting those questions in, and at the bare minimum, week 4, we will create space to do those questions. A couple of things, though, before I hand it to Dan, is one, if you enjoyed at all your table discussions, and hey, it's kind of helpful to be able to process important things with other like-minded Christians. I want to encourage you to consider you could have something like this in your life every week through a community group or a discipleship group. So if you're not involved in one of those, I hope maybe this conversation helps you see I need other Christians to process life with. If you're interested in that, let us know. We can connect you. The last thing I want to say, though, pastorally is maybe the conversation tonight opened up some things in your heart or in your family or experience. And so if anything we talked about tonight you would like to process with someone on a more individual level, please, please, please reach out to us. Any of our pastoral team, we have counselors. I see my wife Annie back there. There's so many men and women in this church who would love to sit down and talk with you through anything you want to talk about, from sexual orientation to gender to abuse to trauma to issues in a marriage or with one of your kids. Just life is really hard. Don't try to do it by yourself. This sexual stuff is heavy and hard and painful, and please let us be a church that walks alongside you and prays for you and loves you. And so if you'd like to talk to someone about that, just you can grab me, you can call the church office, you can send us a message on the website. There's 1,000 ways you can reach out, whatever you're comfortable with. And of course, we'll keep all that private. But consider doing that. Let us walk with you through anything the Lord may have brought out tonight. All right? Thanks, Dan.